Okay, this is the last chapter in Module 3. We will be talking about the endocrine chapter. Okay, so let's go ahead and get on presentation. Okay, so this is ALHS 1011. This is Module 3, the endocrine chapter. Here are our learning objectives from the KMS standards. Okay, so the endocrine system, just similar, and that's why we put this together with the nervous system. This is a messenger system. So whereas the nervous system is an electrical messenger system, this is a chemical messenger system through something called hormones. Hormones are the mode of transportation. They are the chemical messengers, and they typically, if they're endocrine, meaning inside, they're secreting, there are organs, there are glands secreting hormones directly into the bloodstream. If it's secreted directly into the bloodstream, then it is endocrine. If it is not, then it's exocrine. The heart and the stomach do not release hormones, but they're also considered endocrine. But that's not their primary role. So there are additional organs that are considered endocrine, but that's not their primary role. The chemical messengers take a little more time than the quick, fast electrical messengers of the nervous system. And they take their time, they're a little slower, and they're also less specific. So whereas the electrical messages of the nervous system are quick, they're fast, and they're targeted, this is more slow release of chemicals, and it is less specific. Our functions of our main endocrine organs. Number one is growth and development. They're responsible for growth and development. Two, sexual maturation, sexual rhythms, energy regulation, helping the body to adjust to stressful situations. Cortisol is released by the adrenal glands. Sometimes the endocrine system is responsible for maintaining electrolyte, fluid, nutrient balance. Specifically, I'm thinking of calcium. And then maturing cells needed for immunity. That would be the thymus. They mature our immune system cells. Okay, so kind of comparing the two, the endocrine system and the nervous system. I like this Venn diagram. These two systems are interconnected. They depend on each other, and they monitor each other's activities. But the separateness of it, let's talk about the separateness of it. The endocrine system has glands, hormones that get transmitted into the bloodstream. It's slow, but those chemical responses last longer. Then the nervous system, they use neurons, neurotransmitters, fast electrical action potentials. It's short acting, it's quick. How are they similar? Both use chemical messengers. Sometimes the nervous system uses neurotransmitters. They both use feedback loops. They both regulate physiological activities to maintain homeostasis. And both respond to stimuli. Okay, so here's the nervous system. Here's a nerve impulse from the cell body. You got the dendrites, and that action potential goes down the axon body as a nerve impulse. Okay, it may secrete neurotransmitter chemicals, which hit target cells. And here's endocrine cells, by contrast, that typically get secreted directly into the bloodstream, and through the bloodstream is how it hits its target cells. Okay, and a little overview of the main endocrine glands. The pineal gland secretes melatonin. the hypothalamus, regulatory hormones, and also ADH and oxytocin, which we'll talk about. The pituitary gland, sometimes they call the pituitary gland the master gland, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. There's two parts to the pituitary gland, the anterior and the posterior. They do different things. Sitting on top of the kidneys, you have the adrenal glands, which have two parts. The medulla of the adrenal glands secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine, and the cortex of the adrenal glands secrete cortisol, corticosteroid, cortisone, aldosterone. On the other side, we've got parathyroid gland secreting parathyroid hormone. You've got the thyroid gland, the thymus secreting thymosin. The pancreas is an endocrine gland or organ secreting glucagon and insulin. And then depending on male or female, the ovaries secrete estrogen or progesterone, and the testes in the male secrete androgens such as testosterone. So that's an overview, and now we're going to kind of dive deep. The pineal gland is found, tiny little pea-sized gland is found in the diencephalon in the brain. Its full function is really not, it's kind of mysterious. They don't know the full function of it, but we do know that it produces melatonin, which rises and falls and during our waking and sleeping cycles. So it is, melatonin is the hormone that triggers sleep, and it peaks at night, causing us to get drowsy. So that's melatonin and the pineal gland. Okay. The hypothalamus, also located in the diencephalon, and it's the hypothalamus is kind of our link between the nervous system and endocrine system. People will call the pituitary gland the master gland, but the hypothalamus is really the commander-in-chief, and it kind of delegates orders, and including the pituitary. So the pituitary is very important, but it gets its, I think of the hypothalamus as like the Wizard of Oz. It's the man behind the curtain, dictating, delegating commands. And the hypothalamus is very, very important to our body's physiology, our homeostasis. It regulates hunger, thirst, fluid balance, body temperature. Very, very important. So lots of hormones come from the hypothalamus, including growth hormone, TRH, CRH, gonadotropin releasing hormones. So all of these kind of delegations to cause other things to happen. And those delegations, those hormones from the hypothalamus, a lot of times will go to the anterior pituitary. And so growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH, causes the anterior pituitary to secrete the growth hormone and targeting the muscle and the adipose cells. TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone, causes the anterior pituitary to secrete TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. And likewise down the line. So the hypothalamus is really given the orders. Okay, so the hypothalamus is given the orders to the pituitary. So if we consider the hypothalamus, the commander-in-chief, the Wizard of Oz, behind the curtain telling everybody what to do, and the pituitary does it. So that anterior pituitary is kind of connected, if you can see, to the hypothalamus. Also the posterior, okay? Okay, so we've talked a lot about now the pituitary gland, calling it the master gland. It is also part of the diencephalon. So inside that diencephalon, you've got the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, the anterior and posterior pituitary. And this one is the kind of the general. It controls all the other glands, but it acts only by orders from the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the commander in chief. Pituitary is a high-ranking general. The hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary, by the infundibulum. Say that word 3 times fast. That's a fun word. That's where it's connected. And then the pituitary has two parts, the anterior and posterior. Okay. So you got the anterior and posterior, and they lots of different hormones, kind of controlling all the other glands. So you got the anterior and posterior pituitary, and this hypothalamus behind the big mouth, giving all the orders. Okay, the posterior pituitary, or the neurohypophysis, is kind of an extension of the hypothalamus, so the back side of it. And it mainly secretes two hormones, antidiuretic hormone, which is ADH, and oxytocin. So they kind of, the hypothalamus has parts that extend into the posterior pituitary, into the back of it. You can see here in green, the hypothalamus is green, the posterior, they kind of share the same cells. So they're connected in their axons with each other. They're kind of codependent. And those neurons secrete ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. Okay. So their pituitary is doing the secreting, but hypothalamus is in charge. Okay, so I mentioned ADH. ADH is antidiuretic hormone. So a diuretic makes you urinate, makes you pee off extra fluid. So if it's antidiuretic, then it causes you to hold on to fluid. It causes you to decrease your urination, which decreases our fluid loss, which increases our blood volume. If we're not peeing it off, then we are increasing our body fluid volume. And we use this in a control. ADH is used to control blood pressure. So if we have increased blood volume, you have increased blood pressure. Okay. And this is another example of a negative feedback loop. Oxytocin is the hormone, the synthetic name is Pitocin, which is given to laboring mothers to help increase or maintain uterine contractions during labor. Also involved in milk production. Men have oxytocin, but the function is unknown. Okay, moving to the front of the anterior side of the pituitary, or the adenohypophysis. Several hormones, as you can see, and several glands are affected by the anterior pituitary. So it maintains and secretes a number of hormones. Okay. It does not, growth hormone kind of affects the whole body. The hormone levels, again, there's a negative feedback loop that comes back to the pituitary and the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus will give the orders to that pituitary gland. Okay, so you can see lots of hormones here affecting a lot of other glands by the anterior and posterior lobe of that pituitary gland. But really, the master, the man behind the curtain, is that hypothalamus. The thyroid gland, moving down to your neck, It's a butterfly-shaped gland kind of over your trachea and in the front of the neck, the anterior portion of the neck, and it secretes T3 and T4 by orders of the pituitary. So the pituitary, or the hypothalamus, tells the pituitary, and the pituitary secretes communication that tells the thyroid gland. The communication is thyroid releasing hormone. And the thyroid gland starts secreting what it secretes. And it secretes T3, T4, and calcitonin. Those are the thyroid gland's main hormones. Calcitonin is involved in our calcium storage. We need T3 and T4 for cell metabolism, also growth. And we need iodine to produce these hormones. So if you are iodine deficient, you can get what's called goiter on your neck and not make enough of these necessary thyroid hormones for growth and metabolism. Okay, so we have the thyroid hormone or the thyroid gland, and you can see that's in sort of peach here. Kind of nestled in the thyroid gland is two pairs, so two pairs of glands called the parathyroid hormone glands, and those are embedded in the posterior, the back surface of the thyroid. And the parathyroid glands secrete parathyroid hormone, which regulates calcium in the blood. So if calcium gets too low, then the parathyroid glands secrete parathyroid hormone, which stimulates bone dissolving cells to break down a little bone and release that calcium into the bloodstream. So if our calcium gets too low, we need it from a source, it's going to signal using this hormone to release some calcium from our bones. Moving down the neck is in the kind of in the center of the chest. In the upper thorax is the thymus. And this plays an important role in the immune system. It produces thymosin, which helps mature white blood cells. Now this in childhood is huge, and it gets smaller as we get to be an adult. And those white blood cells are very much needed to fight infection. The pancreas. So the pancreas is exocrine and endocrine. And exocrine, remember, does not secrete directly into it does not secrete hormones directly into the blood system. It secretes digestive enzymes into the pancreatic duct, which ends up in the small intestine. So it uses ducts. For our purposes for this chapter, we're going to talk about the endocrine functions. It has the pancreas has islets of Langerhans, which secrete two hormones: glucagon, which raises blood sugar, the blood glucose, and insulin, which lowers blood glucose. So for hypo, meaning lower, hyper, higher, glycemia is just a blood condition of sugar. So if we have high blood sugar or high blood glucose, the pancreas is going to secrete insulin so that the insulin can backpack and carry glucose into the cells, because glucose is too big for our semi-permeable membranes. So it needs insulin, the protein, to backpack or carry it in. And then that in turn lowers our blood glucose because that glucose is being used by cells. Conversely, if we have low blood sugar, then the pancreas secretes glucagon. And glucagon tells the liver to release some glucose from glycogen. So glycogen gets stored in the liver and also the muscle. And when we need it, if we have low blood glucose, glucagon will tell the liver and or muscle cells to release some glycogen, which becomes glucose that we need to raise our blood sugar. So that's kind of those negative feedback loops for hypo low and hyper high glycemia. Here is a great little video.
Two of the organs involved are the liver and the pancreas. The liver is reddish-brown in colour and is the largest organ inside the body. The pancreas produces enzymes and hormones. If your blood is rich in glucose, it stimulates the pancreas to release a hormone called insulin. Insulin makes the liver remove the glucose and store it as a carbohydrate called glycogen, reducing the amount of sugar in the blood. Vigorous exercise also affects the level of glucose in your blood. When your muscles are working hard, they're using glucose as a source of energy. The blood sugar level of our magazine reader rises and falls gently. The bike rider's sugar level falls more dramatically. But what if he kept on going? What would happen if too much glucose was removed? When the blood contains too little glucose, the pancreas releases a hormone called glucagon. This makes the liver convert some of its stored glycogen into glucose and increases the blood sugar content, bringing the glucose level back to normal.
Okay, so that was just kind of a helpful visual. Okay, moving down the body from the pancreas, we have the adrenal glands, and these are a pair of glands that sit on top of the kidneys like little baseball hats. And the adrenal glands have two regions. They have the cortex, the outer layer, and the medulla, the adrenal medulla in the inside, the middle. Okay, let's talk about the medulla, the middle. This one releases two hormones, epinephrine, which we also call adrenaline, okay, in that fight or flight response of the sympathetic nervous system, adrenaline or epinephrine is released, and norepinephrine, which is both a hormone and a neurotransmitter. Like I said, these hormones are have to do with the sympathetic nervous system. So this is another example of how the nervous system and endocrine system go hand in hand. These last longer. If you ever gotten scared or had an adrenaline rush for any reason, you know that it kind of lasts longer than the event lasts. And what happens in that is increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased respirations, sweating, and dry mouth. Okay, the cortex, the adrenal cortex, the outer coating. This makes lots of steroid hormones. And we call those steroid hormones collectively, we call them adrenocorticosteroids. And the anterior pituitary, it kind of directs this. And you have mineral corticoids, glucocorticoids, androgens, and a lot of these are very, very, very important to the body, these corticosteroids. And if we don't have them regulated, that can be fatal. Okay, the gonads. The gonads is a collective term for either testy or ovary, depending on male or female. And the primary function of the testicle and the ovary is to store and produce gametes. So gametes are the sex cells, and sex cells being eggs for ovaries and sperm for testicles. And both these secrete hormones, and the testicles produce testosterone, and the ovary secretes estrogen in women. Okay, we mentioned before that the heart and the stomach also are considered endocrine organs. The heart secretes something called atrial natriuretic hormone, and the digestive system secretes several different hormones. Okay, hormones. So how does this work? So the endocrine cell, whatever organ it is, releases hormones directly into the blood system. Those hormones, those chemical messengers, get carried around the body through the circulatory system, sometimes affecting millions of cells simultaneously, sometimes waiting for the target cell. Their effect, those hormones, last minutes, maybe like adrenaline or epinephrine, hours, possibly days, like estrogen, progesterone. Many hormones are secreted all the time in different amounts. They change, they regulate. There are three different categories of hormones: steroids, amino acid derivatives, and proteins. Okay, so steroids. This is a special class of hormones. They're powerful because they bind to sites inside the cell. So rather than binding to the cell membrane, they're binding to sites inside the cell. Like lipid molecules, they pass easily through the target cell membrane, so they don't have to require ATP or a carrier protein or anything like that. They interact directly with that cell's DNA, and they change cell activity that way. So steroids are kind of powerful. They are carefully regulated because we only need small amounts, and we derive steroid hormones from cholesterol. An example of a steroid hormone is estrogen. So it can just float into a cell, mess with the DNA, and change a whole cell's activity. Hormones, the second class, is amino acid derivatives. And amino acids, remember, are building blocks of protein. Okay, amino acids are little parts of a protein. And the example being epinephrine. So epinephrine does not pass through the cell membrane. It has to bind to the outside of the cell membrane. So it's not like the steroid. Protein hormones, as in insulin. Insulin is a protein, and it's made of chains of amino acids. These hormones are too large to pass through the plasma membrane, so they're carried through the bloodstream. Target tissues. So when a hormone is released into the bloodstream, it travels, and it's going to look for receptors on a target cell, either on the cell membrane or inside the cell, as in the case of the steroid. And the water-soluble ones are going to bind to receptors inside the cell, because remember that cell membrane is hydrophobic. It's got a phospholipid bilayer. So if you're water soluble, you're going to bind to the outside. Okay. Lipid soluble or fat soluble, like a steroid, you can see in the top picture, steroids can pass right through. So they bind to receptors inside the cell, and they kind of have easy access because they're already fatty. Okay, how hormones work. So the circulating hormone, the endocrine cell we have here, secretes a hormone that floats in the bloodstream. Some of them hit receptors on the outside of the cell. Some of them can pass through, as in a steroid, that can target the cell on the inside. So if the hormones bind to the outside, they can do several different changes. They can change the permeability. They can send a message. They can change the enzyme activity inside the cell. But if it goes directly in, we know that it can mess with the DNA and it can mess with cellular activity. Okay, so different methods of delivery methods of hormones. So autocrine, auto meaning self, means the cell stimulates itself. So the target site is on the same cell. Paracrine, para meaning near, nearby cell, it doesn't have to enter the bloodstream. So the endocrine cell is going to secrete, and those hormones are going to bind to a nearby cell. If it's endocrine, that means the hormone enters the bloodstream. So the endocrine cell secretes the hormone and it enters the bloodstream. A pheromone means chemicals ignite a response outside the body in a different individual. If you ever known sexual pheromones, where people are attracted to each other because of chemicals they're releasing. So how does the body control endocrine activity? The amount of hormones secreted depends on situational demands. So when we are stressed, we are going to release different amounts of cortisol. If we are scared, we might release epinephrine. This is all happening. Many organs are secreting simultaneously and continuously. So just depending on the need, how much. So how are they regulated? Changes in our internal environment means humoral. Maybe changes by another gland may tell them, another endocrine gland may use hormones to regulate another hormone. Sometimes the nervous system is the boss and they're in control, and that's called neural. So homeostasis and negative feedback, as you know from the beginning chapters, the body craves homeostasis or internal balance. And when the body's chemical, physical things like blood pressure, blood oxygenation, heart rate, blood sugar, those all have a set point or an ideal level. So we all have a range. This is a good heart rate. This is a good set point for our blood sugar. And the endocrine system and the nervous system work day and night all the time to keep those levels near or at ideal. And we use that negative feedback loop to bring lots of different characteristics of the body back to the set point. Okay. So here's an example, negative feedback and hormones. So you eat food, I ate cake, let's say, and my blood glucose level increases. So I've got more glucose in my blood than I need. My pancreas secretes insulin, the protein insulin. Insulin acts on my body cells. It's sort of like a hiker with a backpack, and it takes up the glucose and it takes the glucose into the cells. Because it's taking it into the cells, my blood glucose level decreases. And that tells the pancreas to slow down the insulin. So that's a negative feedback loop. Same thing with blood pressure. Same thing with a lot of different elements of the body. So a lot of times hormones work the same way. Hormones, we have more when we need it, and then it senses the body with a negative feedback loop to turn it off or slow it down. Okay, hormonal control. So sometimes other hormones boss around glands. So we have a hierarchy. Who's the boss? One gland controls the release of hormones by another gland, basically. So it depends which gland is kind of higher up on the chain, who's more important. And obviously the hypothalamus is the big guy. That's the director, the commander in chief. So that the hypothalamus a lot of times will send messages to the pituitary, which then sends messages, hormones directly to the glands. And this negative feedback loop helps keep things in balance. So sometimes hormones need to be regulated for secretion and distribution. Thyroid, steroids bind to the plasma proteins. So not all hormones are released at once. We're kind of taking turns. What's most important? Protein hormones do not need to bind to plasma proteins because they cannot enter the cell. Okay. So receptor regulation. Sometimes we have an increased number in the number of receptors for a given hormone, and this increases a cell's sensitivity. So if I have more receptors, I'm going to be more sensitive to a hormone, and thus I'm going to have a bigger response to that hormone. I'm going to be more affected by that hormone. Down regulation is the opposite. So if there's a decrease in the number of receptors, there's a decrease to that sensitivity. And then by default, a decreased response. So how do we eliminate hormones? How do we get rid of it? We excrete hormones by our kidneys. Sometimes we metabolize or break down. Enzymes will break down hormones. Sometimes we have active transport, so we'll reuptake and move hormones. Conjugation, the liver combines with the hormone with water-soluble substance. So the hormone plus a water-soluble substance will allow us to secrete or urinate a hormone. And then sometimes just time, the half-life, the length of time it takes for about half of that substance to be removed. It's called the half-life. There's a couple little scenarios that might be helpful. We kind of talked about the insulin glucagon secretion one. Depending if blood glucose is high, blood glucose is low. If it's low, glucagon is released by the liver, which stimulates, the pancreas secretes glucagon, which tells the liver to release glycogen, which can be broken down into glucose to raise our blood glucose. And likewise, if our blood glucose is too high, the high blood glucose tells our pancreas to secrete insulin, which carries that extra insulin into cells. An example of positive feedback, I think the best example is oxytocin. But sometimes we can also do the flow of sodium into a neuron during depolarization. So you can have more and more, positive feedback loops are more. They're the vicious cycle. This is not a good way to regulate the body because it increases change away from the set point. It's not trying to bring things back in. It's more. It's moving us away from the step point. But that is a way that we can regulate hormones. And this is a great example of that, oxytocin in childbirth. So number one, you have the head of the fetus pushing on the cervix. That physical pressure sends a nerve impulse from the cervix to the brain. The brain, the hypothalamus in the brain, tells the posterior pituitary, the back end of the pituitary, to secrete oxytocin. The oxytocin stimulates uterine contractions, and it's a positive feedback loop where it's more until the baby is born and there's no longer pressure on the cervix. And that's what shuts off that positive feedback loop. Okay, so this could be harmful if it was not broken. We cannot be in labor forever. So the intensity of the contractions it's more and more from the posterior pituitary, increasing the contractions. And what interrupts the cycle is the baby is born and there's no longer pressure on the cervix. That might be the last one. Yep, that's the last one. So I'm going to stop sharing. That is the endocrine system.